Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome into today's daily Bible reading for February the 1st. We are going to be in Isaiah 32 and also Luke chapter 14 today. We've made it through January, and if you have been with us all throughout this first month, that first month of the year, thank you for doing so, and I hope that you've been blessed by our readings in Isaiah and in Luke. And we look forward to continue blessings as we go throughout the New Testament and also the Old Testament prophets this year. I would venture a guess to say that most of us are very familiar with the New Testament writings, maybe not so much with the prophets, but I do hope then that the readings in the prophets will help to familiarize ourselves with them and their very important message, and that through it we might learn more about the Lord and be better servants of his. Again, thanks for being with us, not just today, but also throughout the year so far. And I continue to bless us in the work that we're doing and reading his word on a daily basis. Isaiah 32 is where we are at today. And let me get that on the screen for us. Isaiah 32, that subheading, A Righteous Kingdom Announced. And I think this text is extremely messianic in nature. Now, there might be the possibility of some of this language being applied to a king that would show up shortly after this in the form of Hezekiah or Josiah, maybe one of those two individuals who served for the most part as very faithful kings to God of Judah. Maybe they fit some of the things that are mentioned here, but I think beyond a shadow of a doubt, what is mentioned within this chapter is very messianic in nature, is looking forward to the time when the perfect king would show up on the scene and would be able to do things in that leads to an incredible result for God's people. Those results are described beginning in verse 15 and going through the end of the chapter, verse 20. So we'll see that once we get there. But just keep that in mind, that more than likely this is mostly messianic in nature, though there might have been some elements that could be applied to a future king, a future good king, a much more godly king than what had been seen in God's people previously. And yet, even for all their goodness, it is just a small taste of what would eventually come in the Messiah. So let's read this text together then in Isaiah 32, beginning in verse number 1. Indeed, a king will reign righteously, and rulers will rule justly. Each will be like a shelter from the wind, a refuge from the rain, like flowing streams in a dry land, and the shade of a massive rock in an arid land. Then the eyes of those who see will not be closed, and the ears of those who hear will listen. Verse number 4. The reckless mind will gain knowledge, and the stammering tongue will speak clearly and fluently. A fool will no longer be called a noble, nor a scoundrel said to be important. For a fool speaks foolishness, and his mind plots iniquity. He lives in a godless way and speaks falsely about the Lord. He leaves the hungry empty and deprives the thirsty of drink. The scoundrel's weapons are destructive. He hatches plots to destroy the needy with lies, even when the poor person says what is right. But a noble person plans noble things. He stands up for noble causes. Stand up, you complacent women, and listen to me. Pay attention to what I say, you overconfident daughters. In a little more than a year, you overconfident ones will shudder, for the grapes will fail, the harvest will not come. Shudder, you complacent ones, tremble, you overconfident ones. Strip yourselves bare and put sackcloth around your waist. Beat your breasts in the morning for the delightful fields and the fruitful vines, for the ground of my people, growing thorns and briars, indeed, for every jealous house in the jubilant city. For the palace will be deserted, the busy city abandoned. The hill and the watchtower will become barren places forever, the joy of wild donkeys and a pasture for flocks, until the Spirit from on high is poured out on us. Then the desert will become an orchard, and the orchard will become like a forest. Then justice will inhabit the wilderness, and righteousness will dwell in the orchard. The result of righteousness will be peace, and the effect of righteousness will be quiet confidence forever. Then my people will dwell in a peaceful place, in safe and secure dwellings. But hell will level the forest, and the city will sink into the depths. You will be happy as you sow seed, beside abundant water, and as you let your ox and donkeys range freely. Again, I think we're seeing the messianic undertones of this text, but just notice that what we see back in verses 3 through 5 is that this king, whoever it is, again, I believe this is primarily a reference to the Messiah, King Jesus, as he will come and what he will allow to take place. But there might be an understanding in which, again, a king like Hezekiah, a king like Josiah, could help some of these things to be seen in a sense. These positive results of what he does here. Really, it's a reversal of the misfortune that has been brought about by sin, where those who had eyes couldn't see, or those who had ears couldn't hear, where the mind could not understand. That there was this reversal, that kind of what we saw earlier, where things that were evil were called good and things that were good were called evil. Well, that's no longer going to happen whenever this king comes onto the scene. And what a blessing that is, that there would be healing by this king. Just as the previous leaders had let the people down, we see in verse 6, the fool speaks foolishness, and his mind plots iniquity. He lives in godless ways. He speaks falsely about the Lord. He leaves the hungry empty, and deprives the thirsty of drink. This failed leadership that had been seen within Israel, that's going to change too. And things that should have been done are now going to be done. Those who had failed, those like the complacent women of verse 9, the overconfident daughters, the overconfident ones, verse 10, the complacent ones, overconfident ones, verse 11, they would be corrected. And this would all lead to this wonderful time that is described in verse 15, which, if you're reading this, you're thinking, man, this sounds really familiar. And it probably does sound a lot like Acts 2. I would say so. It sounds a lot like what's going on, what is described as happening in Acts 2. And we're going to see similar language later on, actually in chapter 35. Something very, very similar is going to be described concerning the desert becoming an orchard, the orchard becoming a wilderness, where these regions, or these areas that are described as being barren, are now going to be turned into areas that are very lush in nature. We're going to see that in chapter 35 as well. And that's what this section 32, 33, 34, 35, it again is almost another one of those summary sections before we get into the historical interlude that's going to be beginning in chapter 36, I believe it is. And just showing how, even though all this bad stuff has happened up to this point, where there's all this judgment against not just the nations, but even against God's own people for their rebellion, against the whole world, in fact, even though that's a reality, there is still hope in the future through this king who is going to reign righteously, who is going to rule justly, who's going to bring about this period of restoration. That's going to be described. That's being described here in chapter 32. Chapter 33 talks about, again, the punishment for sin, the judgment of the nations, chapter 34. But again, here comes the hope in 35, that even with all this happening, there is going to be hope of restoration. Verse 35, or chapter 35, again, very messianic in nature. We'll see that in just a few days. But that is Isaiah 32, the pronouncement of the coming righteous and just king, and all the goodness that is going to be made available through the proper way that he rules. Even though these people have been let down very, very much so by their leadership previously, there would come one. Again, I believe primarily the Messiah is in play here, but maybe small foretaste in Hezekiah and in Josiah, but ultimately through the Messiah King who will come in the future. He will make these things absolutely possible. Isaiah 32. Let's shift our attention now to our text in Luke, which is Luke chapter 14 today. Excuse me, Luke 14. And once you know it, we are still talking about the Sabbath. That just seems such a common point of contention within this section of Luke, between Jesus and the leaders of the time. They really did not like the fact that Jesus did so much work on the Sabbath. They didn't like the fact that he healed on the Sabbath. And here's an opportunity where Jesus, once again, has the opportunity to heal someone, but he's going to really confront them over this issue and say, hey, should I do this or not? And we're going to see how they react. But then we're going to see a lot of teaching within this text about being invited to follow Jesus and what that means. What is demanded whenever it comes to following Jesus? That's going to be a main point of emphasis in this text as well. Let's get into it though. Luke chapter 14, verse number 1, reading from the Christian Standard Bible. One Sabbath, when he went to eat at the house of one of the leading Pharisees, they were watching him closely. This is all referring to Jesus. Jesus went to a house. They're watching Jesus closely. And there in front of him was a man whose body was swollen with fluid. In response, Jesus asked the law experts and the Pharisees, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Remember, this is a big point of contention that we've seen in chapters 12 and 13. But they kept silent. He took the man, healed him, and sent him away. And to one of them he said, which of you whose son or ox falls into a well will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? They could find no answer to these things because they know exactly how they would respond. Obviously, they would do such, they would show mercy to their son or their ox, but obviously Jesus not allowed to show such mercy to someone in dire need. Nonetheless, he goes on, he says, the text tells us that he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they would choose the best places for themselves. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, don't sit in the place of honor because a more distinguished person than you may have been invited by your host. And the one who invited both of you may come up and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in humiliation, you will proceed to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place so that when the one who invited you comes, he will say to you, friend, move up higher. You will then be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, when you give a lunch or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors, because they might invite you back and you would be repaid. On the contrary, when you host a banquet, invite those who are poor, maimed, lame, or blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And when one of those who reclined with him at the table heard these things, he said to him, blessed is the one who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. And then he told him, a man was giving a large banquet and invited many. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to those who were invited, come, because everything is now ready. But without exception, they all began to make excuses. The first one said to him, I have bought a field and I must go out and see it. I ask you to excuse me. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. I ask you to excuse me. And another said, I just got married. Therefore, I am unable to come. So the servant came back and reported these things to his master. Then in anger, the master of the house told his servant, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the city and bring in here the poor, maimed, blind, and lame. Master, the servant said, what you ordered has been done, and there's still room. Then the master told the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and make them come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, not one of those people who were invited will enjoy my banquet. Now great crowds were traveling with him. So he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you wanting to build a tower doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to ridicule him, saying, this man began to build and was unable to finish. Or what king going to war against another king will not first sit down and decide if he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If not, while the other is still far off, he lends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. In the same way, therefore, every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. Now, salt is good, but if salt should lose its taste, how will it be made salty? It isn't fit for the soil or for the manure pile. They throw it out. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen. Again, we open up this chapter looking at more of the Sabbath controversy, and there's just this unwillingness of the people to recognize the mercy that Jesus is showing as he heals on the Sabbath, that he's not in violation of the law, that mercy is a real thing, and that here is God wishing to extend mercy to a cursed people, in a sense, that because of the sin of mankind, we have all of this punishment being seen among people. And here is God, here's the glory of God who has appeared among mankind, coming to bring restoration to his people and to prove so through this type of healing. And yet they're just unwilling to see and recognize what is taking place. Therefore, it shouldn't surprise us that he then begins to talk about humility. There's a lot of teaching on humility here within this text. The first parable, of course, talking about going into a place and assuming the highest position. He's like, no, you should assume a position of humility, and then that will give you the opportunity to be exalted, which leads to verse number 11. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And the same thing here. Humility is reaching out to those who you might not see as worthy. Therefore, you need to invite those who are in these positions of difficulty, the poor, the maimed, the lame, the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. Those should be people that you give your attention to. You're not better than them. No, you should be willing to help them. And what this shows is that you're willing to help people who are not able then to turn around and reciprocate that to you. It's easy to help those who are on the same level as us, because there's the expectation then that they would do the same for us. But true humility and true service is helping those that we know cannot help in return. So here then is another opportunity for humility for these people to put aside whatever it is that's going on in their lives in order to accept this invitation to come and to be a part of this banquet. And there's so many who are not willing to do so. So Jesus says, go and invite those who have nothing else to turn to. And again, we see there must be a willingness to lay aside self in order to pursue Jesus. And that culminates then in this very well-known teaching where Jesus talks about those who want to follow him. If they want to follow me, then they need to bear their cross. If they can't be my disciple. They need to consider the real ramifications of being my disciple, because if they don't, then they might not make it. But really, what is the most difficult portion of this chapter, I would say, is verses 25 and 26. Or I guess verse 26 specifically, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, he cannot be my disciple. And that's caused a lot of issue for a number of people. Why should I hate these people? I'm told to love these people. But let's finish the verse. Notice, even his own life. I think what we're seeing here is the setting of the priority in life. The priority in life is not father or mother, wife or children, brothers or sisters, even self. No, the priority must be Jesus. He must be our priority. Notice I'm saying priority, not that he's the top of our priorities. Priorities is actually like an oxymoron. How can you have multiple priorities? No, there is only one priority, and that should be Jesus. And here, I believe, that's what he's saying here. The one priority must be Jesus, that you are so enamored and in love and devoted to Jesus that everything else might as well not even be there. And someone might say, well, how then can God teach us how to be good sons or daughters or husbands or fathers or brothers? How can he tell us we must be good in these positions if we're to act as if those things don't exist? Well, we recognize that if we are so totally devoted to Jesus, that part of that is fulfilling these roles in the proper way. That we see our parents, we see our spouses, we see our children, we see our siblings through the lenses of being a disciple of Jesus. That's how we see them. We see them in that manner, and we treat them appropriately because of that devotion we have to Jesus. See, everything within this text comes back to Jesus. Is he the priority? Is he the one through whom everything else about who we are flows? He must be. And if he is not, then then we're not going to be those people who are able to accept the invitation to the wedding or to the banquet because we've got too much other stuff to do. We're going to be the person who, whenever we have the opportunity to take the position of honor, we're going to take that and not exhibit humility as we should. And what that leaves us is for no opportunity of exaltation of Jesus. So everything in this chapter, never think about Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, humility, that's the word. It's humility. It is a devaluing of self and the lowering of everything else in life in order to exalt Jesus to the position of he is the priority. He's not the top of my priorities. No, again, that's an oxymoron. He is the priority. He's the one I serve. He's the one that I want to devote everything to. And when I devote myself entirely to Jesus, then I can properly behave in these other realms of my life. So is our priority Jesus? If he's not, then we need to look at increasing humility and a reevaluation of what we see as being most important in life. Jesus deserves that top spot, or he deserves the spot. And we recognize that we are benefited by allowing him to have that spot, the one spot being the thing in our lives. There's a benefit to that because he's going to help us in every other way. So let's think about that today. Let's think about Jesus being the one who deserves that priority in our lives and how everything else will flow through him. And in fact, that ties in well to what we saw in Isaiah 32, because when this king comes, he will rule righteously, rule justly, and he will bring a tremendous amount of blessings. And certainly following Jesus allows us to enjoy the blessings that God promised he would bring as he came as the Messiah to rule as king of his people. Thanks so much for joining in today in Isaiah 32 and also Luke 14. We're going to be back at it tomorrow on Wednesday, February 2nd for our reading in Isaiah 33 and also Luke 15. Hope you can join in there. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave those in the comment section or reach out to us. You can do so through our website, loudoncoc.org, or you can search our Facebook page, the Loudon Church of Christ. You can find us there and access any of the material that we've through the efforts of our church. Again, thanks for tuning in today. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.